We're very happy to introduce today's topic and speaker. Here to speak about conducting California legislative history and intent research is Chris Micheli. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Micheli is the last name. The CH is like a K in Italian. Welcome, everybody. I'm here in Sacramento, across the street from the state capitol. I own my own lobbying firm and have been doing that the last 25 years now. I've also served the last 10 years as an adjunct professor at my alma mater, McGeorge School of Law in Sacramento. And next hour, I'm gonna give you a high level of how to conduct research into California legislation and efforts to understand the intent of the legislation and some of its history. It's not as extensive, I will point out, on a few occasions in comparison to that which exists at the federal level, unfortunately. That is primarily because California, for example, does not have a verbatim transcript of legislative debate, either in committee or on the floors. And so, yes, today you can get on the LegInfo website. It is called leginfo.ca.gov. And that within 24 hours of committee hearings and floor sessions, that information, those videotaped hearings and floor sessions have to be posted on the legislative websites of the Assembly and the Senate. But it's not as extensive as the congressional record, for example. So the primary sources of legislative intent and history in California is generally established by both statute and case law. There's a provision of the Code of Civil Procedure, CCP, Section 1859. It was actually enacted about 150 years ago in the early 1870s, when the first 4 or 5 codes were established in California. That obviously those 29 codes contain our statutes. And what CCP Section 1859 says is that in the construction of a statute, the intention of the legislature is to be pursued if possible. And the courts have always drawn a distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic aids of legislative intent. The intrinsic analysis is coming from the statute itself and the context in which that statute is found. Of course, in California, we have both codified and uncodified statutes. The distinction is the codified ones are those that are found, again, in the 29 codes, as opposed to the federal statutes, which are in titles, which are given numbers. California's statutes are given names. The first one is business and professions. The last is welfare and institutions. And of course, there are 27 codes in between, from the CCP to the evidence code, government code, streets and highways, health and safety, etc. I counted 2 years ago, because as my wife says, I'm a legislative geek. I actually counted all the statutes in those 29 codes. There are just over 155,000 individual statutes that are found. So that intrinsic analysis is basically, as the courts have said, working within the so-called 4 corners of the enacted statutory language. Oh, sorry, I was mentioning codified statutes. Uncodified are those that are still statutes. They're passed by the 2 houses of the legislature and generally signed by the governor. Technically, a bill can become law without the governor's signature. We have a so-called pocket signature as opposed to a pocket veto at the federal level. But we do have a number of uncodified statutes. Those are ones that are basically one-time things. For example, naming a state building or something after somebody. Probably the most well-known example of an uncodified statute is our annual state budget. So again, the courts with an intrinsic analysis are looking at the enacted statute, and they of course include the surrounding statutes to give the particular one that they're examining its context. And they, in that case, they're utilizing some principles of statutory construction that are similar to what the federal courts utilize. Extrinsic aids are utilized to construct the legislative history of a statute, to understand basically the wider historical circumstances surrounding the adoption of these statutes. And so there's a fair amount, again, less so in comparison to the federal level, but then nonetheless, we have extrinsic evidence of legislative intent that, of course, is found outside the statute and the statutory scheme. So it could be things like historical background, everything from committee and floor analysis to even media reports. What is the problem that the legislature was attempting to address? How did the statute come about? Other pieces of evidence that may be considered in looking at the statute itself. And so what we're getting into here, of course, is how do we find and put those pieces of extrinsic aids, and how do we basically reconstruct the legislative history of an enacted statute. So for those who need to research the legislative history of a bill in the California legislature, there are a number of options to use. When I first was a law clerk almost 30 years ago in the first law firm that I worked for that did government law and policy and lobbying, I spent a fair amount of time in the California State Archives on microfiche, looking back at old committee and floor analyses and other documents, again, extrinsic aids, trying to understand what was the legislature attempting to do when they enacted a particular statute. I've tried to, throughout this presentation, sort of have you pose questions to help you make your way through putting together that legislative research on an enacted statute. And before you get started on your research, I think it's important to have some general familiarity with how bills are enacted in the California legislature. From the proverbial 30,000-foot level, of course, it's similar to the other 49 states in the federal government. Of course, we have two houses like the US Congress, and generally bills go through one or more policy committees, potentially a fiscal committee. About 80% of the bills in the California legislature are considered by the fiscal committee, which means that there is believed to be some sort of state or local fiscal impact of that legislation. And then to the floor, of course, first in the House of Origin, and then when the bill goes to its second house or the other house. So assembly bills over to the Senate and Senate bills over to the Assembly. And then they repeat the process. So again, similar to what you got in your high school civics class. But there are a number of differences between the Assembly and Senate, in the California Legislature, Policy and Fiscal Committees. For example, the jurisdictions of those committees, how they each write their analyses, what sort of information they may or may not provide. There are 33 Assembly committees today and 22 Senate committees. Some have the same name, the Senate Public Safety Committee and the Assembly Public Safety Committee. But there are other committees, as you can imagine, more in the Assembly that don't have an exact counterpart in the Senate, since they have 11 more committees in the lower house, which has 80 members versus the 40-member Senate. So, there are a number of different entities that create documents that are considered during the California legislative process. And by the way, it's not just the legislative committees and the floors of the two houses, but there are also the Department of Finance, which is equivalent, sort of equivalent to the President's Office of Management and Budget, although OMB has a broader scope of authority. But the Department of Finance is most well known for being the governor's budget advisor, but they also prepare fiscal analyses of all the bills that have some sort of fiscal impact. Some of those are made public during the legislative process. Others are just given to the governor when the governor is considering whether to sign or veto bills. And DOF, Department of Finance, analyses have repeatedly been accepted by California courts as indicative of legislative intent. Of course, perhaps there might be some irony because that's an executive branch department that works for the governor, but nonetheless is viewed by the courts as imparting some insights into the intent behind legislation. Others in the executive branch, state agencies and departments, prepare analyses of bills. While many don't get considered during the legislative process, they all prepare something for the governor's consideration if it affects their operations or it touches upon a subject matter that they're charged with, enforcing, interpreting the laws, like environmental laws, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, or the Cal EPA agency, for example, in the state of California. So I think it's important when you research legislative history of an enacted statute in California to have some basic understanding of the legislative process, what legislative history research in this state really embodies to help ascertain what the legislature may have intended when they were enacting a new law or amending an existing statute. And so it's important to remember that even with the courts always start with a plain reading of the statute, right? In fact, they generally say that there's no reason to resort to, for example, extrinsic aids in helping to ascertain what the legislature intended if the plain language of the statute is in fact clear. But it's rare that there is some sort of legal dispute, whether a part of litigation or potentially becoming the subject of litigation, but undoubtedly some sort of dispute, that there isn't some ambiguity in the law, which obviously leads you to conducting some history and intent research. I think an important thing to consider also is how much time you have to spend on this project, i.e. your research project. And I'm going to mention it down the road, but also whether or not it makes sense for you to do the research or there are a couple, mainly two commercial for-profit, if you will, firms that conduct this type of research, which I'll mention down the road. But sometimes, you have to do this legislative history very quickly. So how much time do you have? And also be aware that online you can find things on that LegInfo website since 1993. Pre 1993 requires going to, and you can do telephone orders, but basically resorting to what is held by the California State Archives and is not online. So if the statute which you are researching and attempting to understand was enacted post 1993, then you can principally rely upon the documents that are online. And for example, some of those commercial entities will do that research for you and track it down. And in fact, they've put together, points and authorities and can actually testify as expert witnesses, et cetera, to authenticate those types of documents. But if it's pre 1993, then keep in mind that either you have to go in person to the archives or submit a request in writing or by telephone. So, again, understanding how much time you have to conduct the research is important. I've heard some people describe state legislative history research, the history itself, excuse me, as elusive. And so, as I mentioned earlier, as opposed to the congressional record at the federal level, which is basically a verbatim transcript of federal legislative proceedings, both in committee and on the floors of the US Congress, the California legislature doesn't publish any transcripts of floor debates or committee hearings. And frankly, even if they did, there's very limited helpful information when it comes to ascertaining legislative intent. So there's frankly not as much valuable material there that you're likely to find, despite sometimes a time consuming effort. So keep in mind that even after maybe spending hours in legislative research, that it may not always come to fruition for you. So avoid, the potential for frustration, if you will, and again, try to figure out how much time you have to dedicate. Now, as we get into checking some of the legislative history resources, again, as I've mentioned, is the material found online generally since 1993, and is that sufficient? Or again, if you're pre 93, are you going to have to visit the state archives? Keep in mind that the materials from the executive branch, the Department of Finance does approve its so-called approved bill analyses. That requires the governor's office to approve the publication, making it public as opposed to publishing it, making it public. So, in other words, the Department of Finance prepares analyses on, again, most bills that have a fiscal impact. They can only share those analyses with the author's office if the governor's office, their boss, approves that analysis. Because once it's approved and shared with the author, it's made public. It is actually posted on the Department of Finance website. But that does not go back to 93. In terms of the analyses from departments and agencies, those are not found online. So again, what's found online is the legislative info primarily. So the bill itself, the text and all the different versions, the history of it, the different analyses, the votes, etc. And you'll need that information, particularly the history, to understand which committees it went through. And sometimes, even though you find, for example, the analysis online, you may perhaps want to request from a committee, say, letters that were submitted by interested parties in support or in opposition of the particular bill that you are studying. Uh, so again, what information is available for that particular statute and the bill, whether online or not? Um, and sorry, I gave the old. It will uh, provide you a link to the newer version. The relevant, the most current information is legeinfo.legislature.ca.gov. On the old Leg Info, they've got the materials back to 1993. In the state archives, what do you find? It's not, they don't have documents from all the different entities for every bill, but they do have everything from authors' bill files. So, of course, it's important to know who is the author. That information is in the history and on the text of the bill, but you would request from state archives, for example, the author's files, and then you'd have to look through them to see. Some are well organized, some are literally the author's name and years worth of materials jumbled together. The individual committees, those files, once they're turned over to archives, those are probably the best sources because they have authors prepare what's called a committee worksheet where they ask questions and gather information. Plus, the committee staff often do their own research on a bill, so they may have studies, academic articles, materials from other states, and things that even the author hasn't utilized, for example. They also, when they get them from the governor's office, the current governor does not turn things over to archives until after they leave office. So if you wanted to try and get information from the governor's chapter to bill files for a current governor, you have to make a Public Records Act request. Otherwise, prior governors, their chapter bill files, and that's where all their information. Historically, most governors in their chaptered bills files, they have material including the bill text, again, department and agency, Department of Finance analyses. Generally, it's the Senate floor analysis as opposed to the assemblies. And of course, they'll have letters of support and opposition that have been submitted to the governor's office. The state archives sometimes are lucky to get agency or department files. Generally, the Senate floor analysis unit turns over their analyses. So, again, these have all been cited approvingly repeatedly by California courts as appropriate and acceptable forms of legislative intent. The state archives can be reached online, but also by telephone. Be prepared that they often have backlogs for research requests, which they will do. For example, you can provide them, I would like to know whatever information you have for if you have the chapter number or the bill number, AB 123 by this author from 1970 or something. So you can phone it in or request it. They do give priorities to walk-ins. This goes back to the issue I said earlier about determining early on how much time you have, for your research project. And as you would anticipate, they do charge, I think it's 25, 30 cents a page for materials that they photocopy. Then they can mail them to you. If you can also have them available to pick up, etc. If you're familiar with the annotated codes like Wesson Deering, and of course today LexisNexis Online and all of that, gather all the relevant information, right? What's the bill? that affected the statute that you're looking at, the current code section, what statute enacted it, amended it, repealed it for that matter, both the bill number, the author, the chapter number, all those things allow you to get access to the relevant extrinsic aids that are out there. You might also want to look at what was the law prior to the adoption of your statute or the statutory changes that were made. You know, there are basically three things that a bill can do. It can add a new statute, amending an existing statute, or repeal an existing statute. So, what did the bill do to the statute that is at issue in your case? And then look at the text of those statutes. So, how did it come into being? What were the changes made? Those are all potentially relevant to determining, intent of the legislature. Maybe something was in and they took it out, for example. So you'll need that information, primarily the bill number, that's the key. But again, if the state archives has the author's bill files, then things like the author's name, the year of enactment, right? When did that bill go through the legislative process? Are there earlier versions of a bill? Now, the committee analyses will generally include towards the end any related legislation. That related legislation section is not just for bills in the current 2-year session that bill was making its way through the legislative process, but also any prior bills. And sometimes you got a decade or more worth of different bills. So sometimes those committee analyses will help you. Of course, in the annotated codes, it will also give you that information, right? The statute, the year, and the chapter number for the bill that originally created the statute, any amendments, et cetera, through that process. So that's also there. So after you have all this information, you're going to then look at the text of from the given legislative session, right, in which that bill was considered, and look for in the text everything from, is there any sort of statement of purpose? In the California legislature, you often find what are called findings and declarations. And it generally starts with the legislature finds and declares blah, blah, blah. It could be one thing. Sometimes there's a litany. They'll often give them numbers, They find and declare the following 5 things. Sometimes less frequent. Most bills do not have those types of statements. Those that do, there's some value to them. Some say it's far less common than even findings and declarations, but sometimes they'll say that the purpose of this legislation or of this act, usually they say, is to do X or Y. And so that's helpful. Those statements are persuasive. They're not binding on the courts. But obviously, if it's consistent with, you or your client's view on how to interpret a particular statute, those types of findings and declarations can be very, very helpful. But again, you want to compare versions of the statute to see what were the changes made through the legislative process. So look at all the different amended versions. This is very easy online, again, from 93 forward, because all you have to do is click a little box in the upper right-hand corner, and it'll actually have a drop down of the different dates of amendments. And then you can click on each one and see how the bill developed or progressed from its introduced version to its enacted version, right, after the governor has acted upon it. But what sort of words or phrases might have been changed, what things came in, what things dropped out. That's all part of the legislative history that can often be persuasive to the courts. The courts have gone so far to actually say that contemporaneous unpassed legislation may be a significant indicator of the intent underlying legislation passed during the same session. So you also want to, again, look at similar bills. Did a similar bill pass or not pass during that session? As I mentioned, Lexis, Westlaw, et cetera, their databases are very helpful. One of those commercial firms called Legislative Research and Intent LLC. They're a commercial provider of legislative history research. They have some complementary research documents and resources on their website. It's www.lri, Legislative Research and Intent, lrihistory.com. These types of companies like LRI conduct, legislative intent research. As I mentioned earlier, they certify the documents that they find, and they have served as expert witnesses in hundreds of cases. You might also want to look in the Assembly and Senate daily journals and weekly histories. Again, from 1993 on, they are online. Pre-93, instead you have to go to the state archives and get it. But here you ask yourself questions like what happened during the process of adopting this particular statute, which committees considered the bill in each house. So this is the type of information that you can find out in the respective Senate and Assembly journals. The other thing that you can find is what we call letters to the journal. And the journal in that phrase or of that description is the Senate Daily Journal or the Assembly Daily Journal. And what those letters to the journal are used for is that the author of a bill will most often use these. There's probably 2 to 3 dozen every year of 800 or 900 new statutes. And they basically are intended to provide a statement of legislative intent. The courts in the state have generally not been a huge fan of those, only because they believe that legislative documents that are quote unquote considered by the legislature as a whole, like a floor analysis, are the most reliable indicators of legislative intent. I've appeared on some panels with judges and appellate court justices and explained to them why the best sources of intent are actually those by the author. But I guess until the appellate courts decide otherwise, they give some value to it, but not as much as things like floor analyses. We've talked a little bit about, again, comparing the versions of the bill. Again, the purpose of that is that maybe new language being added or language being deleted, not just from the statute, but from the bill itself, can help clarify what the legislature intended. And the dates of the different versions are found on the top of the bill with the most recent date at the top. You can also follow along in the Legislative Council's digest. The attorneys, about 85 of them in the California Office of Legislative Counsel, they're the bill drafters for California legislators. There's one office. At the federal level, there's an Office of Legislative Counsel for the House and one for the Senate. Seems logical. Part of every bill, according to our joint rules, is that everyone must contain a Legislative Council digest, and that's required to start on the first page of every California bill. And it says 2 things: existing law, this bill does. So the Legislative Council digest explains in a objective and nonpartisan, doesn't take a side. An objective explanation in one paragraph, existing law does the following, and then the next paragraph after, this bill does what, add something by description, amend something, or repeal something, or a combination thereof. And that's very helpful, and helps you determine, for example, when your language came into the particular bill and how it's been changed before or after that. Again, I mentioned one of the court cases where they said that previous legislation that is related but failed passage is relevant to ascertaining legislative intent. So any history that you can find of a predecessor failed bill is considered to be relevant by the California courts. Checking the websites, we've talked about the websites, not just Leg Info, but again, Assembly and Senate, they're easy. It's assembly.ca.gov and senate.ca.gov. And again, pursuant to Prop 54 in 2016, adopted by the voters of the state, within 24 hours of every hearing and floor session, they have to post on their website. So it's on the individual House websites, not Leg Info, where those videos and audio tapes of hearings and floor sessions are. So those began January 2018. Those were the first ones. So if you're looking for audio video prior to 2018, you can't find it online there. The courts have accepted some stuff related to media coverage. So depending on whether your particular statute is of high public interest, the media coverage of it might provide some insight as to why the statute was adopted or what basically prompted the need for change in the law. In other words, what issue or problem what issue were they trying to address or problem they were trying to solve, right? And so you might benefit from reviewing any relevant news coverage prior to or during or shortly after the statute was enacted. That sometimes can provide good insight into what the legislature was contemplating. Once you've done those types of things, it makes sense, particularly for a newer bill, to contact the state assembly or state Senate committee or author offices. Some legislators today, they can serve a maximum of 12 years in one house or the other, or a combination, but that's lifetime. I only raise that because some legislators wait until their time is up. Sometimes they serve 6 or 8. A few are going to serve 12 years. They can wait, or they can annually, for example, turn over their records to the California State Archives. But for a more recent statute, particularly for one where a legislator is still in office, it makes sense to contact the author's office to see if you can get access to their bill file or files. And same thing with the relevant committees. Some of the Senate and Assembly committees at the end of every 2-year session, which concludes in the even numbered year like this year, they'll turn over their committee files to state archives. Others have accumulated them for years before they end up turning them over. So as you can probably imagine, they might have some very helpful stuff, and it may be very insightful into what were they trying to do and why were they trying to do whatever it is in the statute. They could have some very useful information. Again, the more recent the legislation, the more likely this will be a fruitful exercise. Otherwise, you're going back to the state archives. Note that the Public Records Act is applicable to the executive branch, not the legislative branch. The legislature has its own Open Records Act. It's called LORA, the acronym LORA, the Legislative Open Records Act. It's found in the California Government Code around section in the early 9000s, like maybe 9050 or 9070. Anyways, it's in the California Government Code, and Laura is intended to provide the public access to legislative records. There is a litany of exceptions, so you can't get everything, but generally the bill files are supposed to be available. What they're trying to limit is like private correspondence, maybe memos or documents between them and their staff. But in terms of the bill files, most of them contain that committee worksheet, letters of support and opposition, maybe amendments contemplated, maybe notes from meetings from advocates or interest groups or constituents who came into their office during the consideration of that bill. The California courts have put together basically a list of what they view as quote unquote cognizable legislative history, which they have generally accepted as evidence of legislative history and intent. Not all of them are produced by the legislature. Number one, admonition number one. Admonition number two, remember that statement earlier I made, like why the courts don't like a letter from an individual author, because they prefer things that are considered by the legislature as a whole. Well, does the legislature consider the Department of Finance analysis? Probably not. Maybe the fiscal committee does. An attorney general opinion, maybe, maybe not. But these are some of the acceptable documents. So just because that's the general standard of the courts doesn't mean that they followed it in all of these. So let me just run through some of the generally accepted extrinsic aids or evidence about legislative history and intent that are accepted by the California courts. Interim hearing studies and or transcripts or files. So for example, any excerpts from public legislative hearings that preceded the enactment of a statute is relevant in ascertaining legislative intent. Other formal studies or recommendations, for example, those published by the California Law Revision Commission or a California state agency or department. The bill backgrounders or the worksheets from those committees. Again, these are generally required by committees. They're filled out by the author's office, and sometimes they have helpful or relevant information. The courts have accepted policy and fiscal committee analyses. Note that there are some partisan versions and nonpartisan versions. The official committee analyses and floor analyses, those are generally available. Again, today they are on the website of LegInfo. The Republican caucus in the Assembly and the Senate, they produce their own confidential analyses for both committee hearings, policy and fiscal, as well as floor sessions. Despite the fact that they only go to Republican legislators, and again, remember that admonition about available to the legislature as a whole, even though these are limited, the courts have repeatedly accepted both partisan and nonpartisan committee and floor analyses. They've accepted Department of Finance fiscal reports. Again, the floor analyses, both partisan and nonpartisan. On occasion, statements by the author for committee or floor purposes. A bill author's letter to the governor. One of the courts said that they're more friendly towards such a letter if the letter casts light on the history of a measure and is a reiteration of legislative discussion and events not merely an expression of personal opinion by the legislator. They've also accepted statements by proponents and opponents, such as letters in support and opposition, testimony provided, and position papers submitted to the legislature, analyses of state agencies and departments, opinions of the California Office of Legislative Counsel, as well as the California Attorney General, our Department of Justice, and also enrolled bill reports to the governor from various state entities, agencies, departments, and the governor's staff. So this isn't an exhaustive list, but I think it definitely gives you an idea of some of the documents that you can utilize, but that also means potentially trying to track down one or more of those documents when researching and enacted statutes. You might also want to take a look at model acts or uniform laws. Model acts are generally proposed by the National Conference of Uniform State Laws. And when they're adopted by the California legislature, of course, like the model penal code or the model probate code, they're intended to be enacted verbatim with some minor modifications or tweaks. So if there is a model act out there that California has adopted, then all of the information related to a model act, because uniformity is sought in those. And so California courts will often rely upon the model act language and other materials related to those model acts. The same or similar notion with a uniform law. The uniform laws are developed by the Uniform Law Commission. It's also known formally as the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws. It was established in the 1890s, and they provide states with legislation that is intended to address some important areas of the law and have a clear and consistent, again, uniform law and utilize and being utilized by individual states. The following sort of a list of key documents, again, based upon what courts have generally found acceptable, is where I pulled this list together. The statutes and amendments to the codes. That's the document, I'm sorry, that's the volume. It's done for each legislative session. And the statutes and amendments to the codes, you can find not just the codified statutes, but also those uncodified statutes, if you're looking for them. You can rely upon the Senate and Assembly final histories, because that has information like author committees. They also have a conversion table where you can have the bill number and it converts it to the chapter number for that particular year and vice versa. The journals, generally the appendices will provide some information related to letters of intent, for example, if there were legislative council opinions that were provided. Several law reviews. My alma mater at McGeorge has what's called the green sheets, or every year they publish a review of selected legislation. Courts have often cited those. Those naturally are in the annotated codes that Weston, Deerings, and others have. The courts have often cited those types of law reviews that shed light on legislative history and intent of particular bills. Now, of course, they're pretty limited. I mean, like the annual green sheets maybe tackles a dozen or 15 bills. So don't necessarily expect to find something, but who knows? Sometimes you're lucky. There are studies from the California Law Revision Commission. Those are available. Newspapers and magazine stories, and other things. Let's see. There's some unpublished original documents, again, from archives and individual offices. Um, Here are my little 5 steps on research, um, sort of to capture some of the stuff we've highlighted. Identify the legislation affecting the statutory language. Usually best to look at the annotated codes to help you determine your language. Again, get those cites, the year. So it'll say statutes of 2024, chapter. So get the year, the chapter number, and stuff like that. Identifying the author and where it went through, the prior law. Um, then obviously relying upon the bill number in most cases. Remember, the chapter number is going to give you information related to the bill, but in terms of most of the legislative research, it's to the bill, because when those analyses are done, et cetera, they're done of a bill. The bill hasn't been enacted yet, hence there's no chapter number. So the most important piece of information is the year of the bill and the bill number and the author, because that's where most of that stuff, particularly at the archives, is going to be ultimately found. Okay. Um, Here's some information for contacting archives. Their phone number is 916-653-2246, and you want to speak with a reference archivist, and they will be able to help you. Yes, they can find out some of the information like the chapter number and bill number and author's name if you happen to not have it, but the easier that you make it for them, the easier they can access whatever information they may have in the archives, instead of having them waste time finding that information. I've always found them to be very helpful. I've never utilized the online request or a phone call because, of course, I work a few blocks from the state archives, which is about a block and a half away from the California State Capitol at 10th and O Streets. And the microfiche and other information is relatively in good shape, and pretty easy to utilize. They also, for older bills, which I utilized a lot, the Senate has 2 partisan analyses in addition to the Senate floor analysis. So they have a lot of records at the archives for the Senate Democratic Caucus and the Senate Republican Caucus. But I've said this before, archives does not have everything for every bill. So I used to end up researching more than one bill at a time often, as a law clerk, and sometimes you would find something from all the sources for a bill, and then you might find just something from the Senate floor analysis unit or something from one committee, not the other 2 or 3 that the bill went through. Or you got lucky and you had an author who kept everything for this bill, but a bill the same year, they didn't pass that along, to the archives. So it's definitely, a mixed bag in terms of what might be there. Again, for the more recent stuff, you're probably going to request information. The committees in the legislature are generally willing to share the information without officially filing a LORA request. And I did find the site, it's California Government Code Section 9070. But some may request the Legislative Open Open Records Act, a formal request under LORA, but many of them are relatively fine with just providing that information. Remember, it's the Public Records Act, Government Code Section 6250, that you're going to request anything from the state agencies or departments. Now, again, I've found that a lot of agencies, if you contact the legislative deputy, the deputy director for legislation, the deputy secretary, are often more than willing to provide access to their legislative documents. There are some who will request a formal PRA to be provided. Don't forget those outside interest groups. They're, again, easily identifiable on the committee analyses, in support and opposition, whether it's a labor organization, an environmental organization, a business organization. They often have some very helpful information, as well. And so you might want to utilize some of the material that those outside interest groups are willing to provide. Sometimes they've done very extensive research that has gone into their letters of support or opposition, for example. And so you might want to reach out to those organizations as well. In terms of historical stuff, yeah, they probably don't keep things for super long, but if you're dealing with more recent legislation, you might be successful in that regard. I know we've got just a few minutes left. If there were any questions, I'm happy to cover them.
Thank you very much, Chris. Please put your questions in the chat. Anyone? Go ahead, we'll give it some time, but thank you. Really appreciate the
No. Okay, well, certainly good luck to you if you have to undertake legislative research. I've got some materials. I have a blog, and it's chrismcheley.blogspot.com and a YouTube channel where I have quite a few videos on the legislative and regulatory processes. I have some of the materials I've gone through on this short program in greater detail on both the blog and videos. So if you want any of that information, that's obviously freely available on YouTube or the blog, and some articles that are out there as well. So, and with that, I think we're at our 60-minute mark, Aaron.
Yeah, I don't see any questions, but that was very enlightening and helpful. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Hey, you're very welcome. Hope everyone has the good rest of the day then.